Hi, and welcome to Lecture 2. Now, this is one of those terrible things to say. This is both the most important and the least important lecture because the basic idea, the what you're trying to learn here is probably the most important thing that you'll get this semester, and that is understanding what ethics are, what you're supposed to think about it. And one of the ways that we do that is by using formal philosophical ethics, and that language is useful as a tool to understand the general subject. But none of the specific language at some level is as important as the understanding we're trying to get to. Ethics is the attempt to be better, right? And whether you're talking about an ethics code that you're applying to a group or your own ethical actions, the goal is really that simple: to try and make better decisions, to try and do better or be better. We seek to perform right or correct actions so that we aren't hurting people, so that we aren't failing to live up to our ambitions. We're not doing something hugely complicated despite all of these words, all of this complex theory. But at the same time, we're actually, most of us, very bad at decision making, bad at determining the right actions. And in that sense, the study, the practice of ethics, whether you think of it as something to do with the professional obligations of an engineer or something to do with simply trying to live up to your own expectations better, trying not to upset your professor or your boss, trying not to hurt people. Those goals, to act rightly, is what we're trying to get at, to work on skills and ways of thinking that are able to help you with that. The key thing about ethics, that they can be directive. They can tell you what to do. They can tell you how to do things. They can tell you which actions are right, and those are the things you do. That's useful. The ability to produce, to understand, or to question and ignore somebody else's rules, how we go about determining those actions, literally gives us the ability to decide what the future will bring. It allows appropriate response to different contexts. It helps us recognize where an impulse, a reflex, or an assumption is harmful, is not doing us any service. In general, ethical theories act in two ways. They're descriptive. They tell us how or what kind of actions will be right, may be right, can sometimes be right. They're descriptive of varieties or categories. And they're also interpretive. That is, when you see something, that specific event, that specific moment, that specific action, how would you go about determining if it's good, if it's a right action, if it's negative or positive? So descriptive or interpretive are related. They're telling you what kinds of things are good or bad. And then separately from that, once you've done the ethical analysis, once you know what kinds of things are right or wrong in a specific moment, as a general theory, as a rule, then ethics can make your life very easy or very hard by being directive. It tells you, do this. Doesn't ask you to think about a rule, it says do it. You have to do it, or don't do this. Never do this. And later we'll come back to this again. We'll talk about how proscriptive, that is with PRO, is telling you to never do something. It's a ban on it. And prescriptive is prescription, like your doctor gives you a prescription, is telling you you have to do something. And when it's at its best, you understand why the ethical system, the framework of ideas, the rules are telling you do or do not. And we learn to see how the parts fit together in this class. That's the goal. How a duty produces a rule, or a demand produces an aim or an intention. How fulfilling that demand produces an act that is good. Or if a rule says don't do that, if it's proscriptive, the banned act is included in that list that says don't do it. And therefore, if you did it, you would know it's bad. Now, sometimes you do bad things. Sometimes you have a cheat day. Sometimes you cheat on an exam because it's the only way to get through. Sometimes you may decide to do a bad thing. All of us carry many different moral, ethical values and systems of right and wrong in our head. And over the course of the semester, one of the things that we'll talk about in this class that's different from how some other people would do it is I suggest that you all have a complex moral framework. That is multiple pieces glued together, stuck together. They're working to help you get through each moment, each decision. But you can improve that, right? Without throwing away the things that matter to you, the things that you've been taught by your parents, the things that are important in our culture. But by understanding how the ethical framework works, you can decide if it's doing it right because it may be hurting you. Something in there might be broken. And whether you're thinking of it in terms of moral or ethical engineering or just trying to make your life a little easier or a little better, the ethical framework that you carry around is something that you can evaluate, tinker with, repair. And one tool to do that, because it allows you to see what's in there, is to recognize ethical theories such as the ones that we're reading about this week. Are they duty-based? Are they naturally produced in the sense that they arise from claims about the nature of the world? Are they evaluating the content or the context of the action? Are they focused on the outcome or the consequence? So whether you're talking about direction or evaluation, ethics is always going to be about trying to understand why actions are right or wrong. Sometimes the most annoying part of this is when you get structural ethics. Those are ones where you don't even like something, but you decide you have to follow that rule. You have to have a piece in that ethical framework because otherwise things get too messy, too broken. Structural ethics are not defined as ethical per se. They're not ethical because everybody in the world has to file their taxes. That's not a natural good. And in some cases, it may even be the wrong thing for you as an individual to do, but you have to file taxes because we've built a whole system of governance, of education, of streets and roads and housing and insurance and healthcare and science, and every single part of that is linked to our idea of the interconnectedness of all people in a society, and the mechanism for that requires us to pay taxes. We live in a democracy. Everybody in a democracy needs to pay attention to information. That means that the information has to be available, so there's an ethic that requires transparency, that is availability of information. And no matter how we go about it, there's sometimes going to be things that you have to agree to because of things outside of your most deeply held ethical beliefs. Ethics are not the same as morals. If ethics are the study or the attempt to get to right action, morals are simply learned observations, individual or social, beliefs about the world. X is right. It doesn't matter if it's right one day or the next day, it's always right. X is wrong. It's wrong the next day, period. Morals generally are taught with claims of universality. That's the way it works. As we move through the rest of the lecture, as you think about the readings or as you move into the readings, one of the things I want you to understand is one of the central reasons to study these things, these languages, the stuff in ethics, is so that you can make arguments and understand the reasoning in that argument for yourself. You can make arguments and understand the reasoning to convince other people. You can make arguments or at least understand arguments and what the reasoning is when somebody else makes a claim, like you should do something. There's a claim and it requires support. That is evidence. And that support has to be the right kind. You have to have a clear basis for why it is, because the support might be just here's a Bible, or it might be here is 100 scientific articles, or it might be, look, the last time you did this, you broke my arm, right? But if you're asking a question that needs to be based on the Bible, you can't talk about a broken arm. And if you need a basis in let's not break my arm, it doesn't help that somebody waves a Bible around. If we're talking to somebody who wants and needs a certain kind of basis, we have to be able to work on recognizing that. And if we've agreed to a basis, we can't use different evidence, different support. The basis can be an ethical theory, and it could be, pretty complicated. But an ethical framework includes those ethical theories that we're reading about this week. And one of the key concepts that we're going to keep coming back to that wasn't in the readings is the idea of warrant. A warrant isn't just a justification. So a warrant, when we talk about it, sometimes I use the example, you've all watched TV, presumably you know that police need a warrant to search a house. And it's often a mistake to think that the warrant refers to the piece of paper. But the warrant isn't a piece of paper. A warrant is the understanding and agreement that the justification is right and based on the right things. So a warrant is not only a statement that we have the right to do something, the right kind of basis and support in an argument, not only that we have the right kind of argument, but that you've checked to make sure that the conclusion is correctly dependent on the basis. So when you give a justification, you might just say, because I want to, but unless the question at hand, your personal preference is the correct kind of basis, you do not have warrant. Whereas if you're asking, how do I decide on the grade to the class? And I said, because I'm the teacher, that's not the right warrant, right? We have rules about how the grading should be done at the school level, in the syllabus. And so you can look at what kind of justification it is and whether the kind of justification it is matches the end result. Decisions and actions are important, and we will try over the course of the semester to see how they work. All right. I mentioned last week that I was going to say this, and we'll keep coming back to this. There isn't a right answer on whether ethics is talking about decision making or actions. In classical philosophy, decisions are an effective part of actions. There's an assumption in philosophy either that these are completely separate or that they are an integrated whole. A decision leads to an action. And in deontological ethics, where the decision-making process is more important, it is useful to think of them as connected. In some ways, that is less important in consequentialist ethic, where you can distinguish the actions producing an outcome and leave the decision-making in some cases. But in consequentialist ethics, you're still worried about decision making because you're having to do predictive measurements in the decision making process. And that means that you're still linking decision making and actions. So in ethics, the decision is more important in deontological ethics, but it is still fundamental, right? We may not be measuring what kind of decision-making process, what sort of assumptions or tenets or principles are being used as defining right or wrong actions. The action is still going to stand on its own as producing an outcome in most consequentialisms, but they are still related. And at some level, I want you to think of them as being connected. The decision and the action have a tight bond for our discussions. And part of the reason for that is that you will have different actions depending on the decision-making process. So if you want to think more about the decision-making process actively, I recommend looking into what's called critical thinking education. I have a link there on the slide to a um, um, one article that happens to be in Medium, which talks directly to the relationship of decision making and actions. But there's tons of resources out there for decision making process.
Three general parts. I'm just going to write them. I was going to write three general parts. We have our background assumptions. And the background assumptions, those are not ever going to tell you what the right or wrong action is. They are not the ethics. Right? This is your religion, your childhood experiences, TV shows you love, favorite teachers' lessons, peer pressure, etc. Does that make sense? Now, whenever we see that stuff, that's going to be informing how we choose to act. Now, the assumptions make our general framework occur. The general framework includes specifically ethical. Now, these are, in many cases, morals that actually direct rules from religion actually try to follow. Things you know carry penalties, laws, norms, etc. This creates the spaces in which you apply ethics. So, for instance, before you ever think about ethics, you will be aware of things like it's illegal to shoot somebody in the face, right? Before you actually have to consider that. Now, before you consider whether it's illegal to shoot somebody in the face, someone will need to have invented firearms. Now, that's a real thing, right? You do not need an ethical approach to talk about something if it doesn't exist. It just isn't important to talk about the ethics of, as much as science fiction writers are great, and in another class we can have a conversation about it, you don't need to worry about aspirational ethics quite that much. If you're like, I'd like to invent an independent robot that is smarter than all human beings, but it'll get mad and kill anybody who didn't work to develop it, right? There's this thought experiment that scared a bunch of futurists called the basilisk. Right? They said, so imagine today that you know that the possibility exists of a robot being made in the future that will be mad that people didn't help build it faster. And you or your children or that which you make will be destroyed by the thing. But everybody who even tries to help build it faster will get rewarded. Yay. What do? That's ridiculous. That's not the way we're talking about it. This is literally like you're sitting in a room, you have to have walls around you, or you'd have to have a warmer coat on. That's the level of stuff we're talking about. Is it right or wrong to be on this class wearing a hoodie sweatshirt, or should you be wearing a tie? That's an ethical decision, a silly one, but it's an ethical decision. Well, you don't make that ethical decision if nobody has produced Zoom, if nobody has made a warm room, if nobody has had those things. So we have a set of assumptions about the world. We have a set of specific conditions. And then within those things, applied ethical systems. And these can be hybrid, deontological, and consequentialist. And in reality, this is one of the reasons I say to ignore virtue ethics. Virtue ethics don't really count as ethics. Virtue ethics are part of those other things. Right? You've grown up in a culture that says rich people are great and poor people suck. That's the culture you live in. You should not think of that as ethics. The entire point of ethics is to move past those background assumptions and have a more reliable set of rules. Now, in this final space, you have structures. Some of you may even believe these structures are universal. In the case of, I have a friend who genuinely believes once a rule exists, the rule has to be followed. That's the way rules work. That's a pretty standard, what's called a basic or structuring deontological belief. Like, if there are rules, the rules should be followed. And if you shouldn't follow those rules, we shouldn't have the rule. Okay, those are basic things. So then you know that at this stage, if there are rules, you follow them. Laws, follow them. Honor code of the school, follow them. Set of rules about X, follow them. The instructions that come with your new cell phone, follow them. Right? Those are ways of doing it. So the ethic there would be a deontological reliance on rules. Now, you may have different kinds of rules, or it may be complicated. Or you may say, rules are useful, but you're always going to temper that with consequentialism, right? That's a hybrid system. Or you're going to be like some people and say, rules actually don't matter, right? Rules are just there to encourage good outcomes. And what we should really be paying attention to are the outcomes, and that's a consequentialist approach. Now, those are all important differences, but we're going to talk over the course of the semester that the most important thing is knowing which is which. And in particular, using the right one for descriptive, evaluative, and directive purposes. So if you remember, I said all ethics can act in these different ways, right? One rule can either be, this is just a rule to direct action, or it can be, did that person break this rule? Or it can be, I will attempt to follow this rule. Those three things are important, right? So from our perspective in both professional ethics and in American culture, one of the key things to being ethical is you just got to know which is which. You can't be like, you're wrong to kill because killing is always wrong, and then turn around and say, they're right to kill because killing in that situation produced a good outcome. You can't do those without recognizing those two things are contradictory. So at the level of ethics, must not be self-contradictory. Because that discredits social negotiation. It also makes you go nuts. Because if you're like, oh no, I believe two contradictory things at the same time, that is basically literally how we define being nuts. Now, the thing is, if you do it as a tactic, persuasion, to win an argument, that's fine. That has nothing to do with ethics. You're welcome to just try and win an argument by playing devil's advocate or by doing anything. We're not talking about that. The question before us, how do I know my actions are right? At its core, that's the question for ethics. We're not trying to figure out. We're not trying to figure out whether or not there is a universal ethics. In this class, we're going to say everybody gets to decide their own ethics until the point they cross into a professional role or another accepted ethics. The thing that we're going to also say is you have to know if your actions are right. Accidents aren't decisions. So we have this very specific question that we're trying to figure out. If you know which ethic you're applying, then you can know what the answer is. And in some cases, it is useful to have languages to be able to distinguish between these things. Because if you don't know how to say, I'm using this kind of ethic or that kind of ethic, then how are you going to be able to be certain you're using anything? The reason to know if outcomes are more important than non-outcomes is so that you know if you want to pay attention to outcomes. Because I love a deontological ethic. I love a simple, basic rule. Because then I don't have to do research or math or gather data. I just know it ahead of time. Right? If I'm like, you do not cheat because cheating is wrong, I don't need to know what happened in your life. I don't need to know you. I just know that cheating is wrong. The moment I switch to a consequentialist approach where I'm like, okay, now explain to me what would have happened to you and to the class and to me if you didn't cheat and if you did cheat. What's the difference? Because I need to know all about those contexts, those situations, that issue before I can make the evaluation. So there are times where we want to know what kind of ethic we're applying because, for instance, if you can find yourself a nice, simple deontological rule, it'll save you homework. And most importantly, it'll save you wondering. Most human beings worry a lot whether their decisions are right. And there's nothing wrong with consequentialist approaches, but answering them takes confidence in the data, time, evaluation, and that means that people are actually really bad at them. Because really, how often are you taking on extra homework? Not very often. So there are reasons to evaluate these things because, among other things, if you want to evaluate how people will play a video game, thinking about the fact that decision-making that takes time, that takes research and consideration, like consequentialist approaches, this doesn't have to be an abstract thing. This can literally be, look, decision-making tends to follow these two paths. They're either outcome-based, in which case they need to have access to information. Transparency, again, is an important structural ethic in almost any consequentialist approach. By contrast, look at, it uses the example for deontological ethics of the Kant. Kant is a philosopher who's very important and he affected the philosophy of ethics a lot. And he used what were called moral imperatives. He said, we don't need like God to tell us what these deontological beliefs are. We can just take what happens inside the rational mind of a human being, and he assumes everybody thinks like him, but that's fine. He's very important, so we aren't allowed to argue with him. But let's assume that everybody's mind works this way. I don't like pain. I'm pretty sure, and by the way, when he says pain, he's not talking about like somebody might be kinky, they might like getting whipping. He means like whatever is a negative experience. That's what he's talking about here. Kant says, I don't like negative experiences, things that harm me at a cognitive, psychological level. I can assume that other human beings are like me and do not want to be harmed. When I am harmed, I have an urge to strike back and harm the other person. I can assume rationally that other human beings, when they are harmed, have an urge to harm that other person. Therefore, if I want to be harmed less, it is rational for me to harm other people less. Some of you will remember where we're going with this. Therefore, I should treat other people the way that I want to be treated, because the best guide to not harming them will be thinking about my own actions. Now, I caution you about this later in the semester when we're talking about design and engineering. We will tell you that this is a bad way to make engineering decisions, but it turns out to be an extremely common form of deontological ethics. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, aside from being common to all of the religions of the book in Western culture, both the biblical and Torah version, but also the Quranic version, is one thing. But it also turns out that this, as a moral and ethical statement, as a way to make decisions, is present in the writings of the Buddha. It's in some version of Hindu theological text. It's present in a very specific way in early Mesoamerican writings that come from the Aztecs. I will say that we always will see the situation of ethics within general assumptions. So, for instance, in the general assumptions category, if you think only some human beings are people, you may only apply do unto others to some of those people, right? So always when we look at ethics, we're going to try and know a little about the assumptions and worldview. Right? This worldview aspect is always going to be a little bit challenging because it's hard to know much of the time. What exactly somebody's thinking about, but we can know a little bit. So the world gets complicated because not every deontological ethics system includes do unto others. There are, in fact, deontological ethics systems that are what are called retributive, right? Where they see there as a basis in the world for justice, defined as an absolute need to punish or harm. Right? So it doesn't matter in the sense of consequences. If somebody does something wrong, they must be executed, period. Right? As an exaggerated example. Right? You sneak out behind the bar and pee in the alley, executed. And you're like, what about consequences? That's excessive. Doesn't matter. Absolute. Right? If the world as it exists to you says that is the rule, that's how it works. And so that issue of worldview having a difference, we tend to, for example, in Western culture, we tend to look at what's called appropriate response or proportional. And believe it or not, there are huge swaths of world history where people did not believe in appropriate and proportional response. Like we had to learn to do that. And appropriate and proportional response, like for instance, if I spit on the street, should I be executed? No, that just seems disproportionate. The linking of consequence to the kind of action that brings it about presumes a set of things in your worldview. And so we think about what's in the worldview so we know Not everybody believes in appropriate response. Not everybody believes in proportionate response. If you're assuming that consequences carry appropriate or proportional response, you're wrong. Consequences are often inproportionate. And one of my favorite ridiculous examples of this is when we see, as an example of the consequentialist approach, utilitarianism is a specific example of consequentialism, right? So in consequentialism, we will have a metric or system to define the consequences as good or bad. In utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mills, the other philosophies who developed it, they're going to tell us specific metrics. So all consequentialisms, the problem of measurement. Is it accurate? And by the way, that's not to say that deontological approaches don't have measurements. Deontological approaches have the problem universalism and suddenly blank you on the word not being shared. Conflicts between group and people. And I'll think of that word next week when it won't do me much good. But and so both of them have these different problems in consequentialism, such as utilitarianism. Anybody remember what the measure is? They mention multiple variations.
Maximum satisfaction.
Yeah, satisfaction or preferences. So utilitarianism says basically what we want to do is how much good minus how much bad positive effect equals action. And what we're really going to substitute in different consequentialisms is what the word good means, right? When I say the word measurement there, you need to know what the word good means, right? So for instance, in a few weeks, we'll be talking a lot. A bad example, all good is measured in money. And let me give you a hint here. There really shouldn't ever have been a point in time where one of the largest ethical theories in use in our world was cost-benefit analysis, which says any decision that is greater value in terms of money is a good, like, that's not how consequentialism has ever historically been practiced. Before the modern era, when this kind of thing was acceptable as a form of consequentialism, that was just acknowledged as selfish bad actions. But now in a period of relative moral relativism, where we get to say what our ethical system is, if somebody says cost-benefit analysis is legitimate, it becomes harder to argue with it. And so, for instance, part of the challenge of deontological non-universalism or universalism is how do And this is something we're going to talk about over the course of the semester. It is not something we're going to solve anytime soon. Now, the thing about it is that after all of this complexity, we are actually in a position to go back to the discussion from last week where we say ethics are complicated. They are applied and fought over technology contains past decisions that make current outcomes. Are those technologies still making good outcomes? Right actions. Like, for instance, anybody here who wonders about whether or not it's a good idea to have a car that spews out poisonous gas, well, it's harder to have that discussion because cars spew out poisonous gas. Right? We literally are living in a world where at any given moment, you are interacting with somewhere between 5 and 100 technologies and technological systems, right? And I'm not even just saying at a moment when you are sitting at a computer taking a class online. I mean, like literally, when you're asleep in bed, you are being affected by artificial lighting and power systems, climate control systems, the walls and other forms of structural systems. Your emails are still piling up. Your devices are still drawing power and doing things. Like, we can literally find hundreds of patterns of technological effect that you're having all the time. And so we need to be able to go back to that discussion last week and occasionally say, let's actually see where that fits in, because technology is socially embedded. As it keeps acting and affecting the world, that's still having some effects. So ethical and moral theories are different things. The ethical framework, which includes the personal as well as those structural, as well as those accepted shared social things like professional ethics. And by the way, it's not only your professional ethics that exist in that category. You have your close personal group of friends, and you guys share rules of right action between you that are different from the society around you. You play a video game online, there may be different rules there. One of the least exciting experiences I ever had was a friend of mine who was a serious Call of Duty player, invited me to play with him once, my first game I'd never played before. And the amount of like viscerally scathing verbal abuse that I experienced in 45 minutes playing, I had not experienced since like 1992 in junior high school. It was horrible. And at the end of the game, everybody was really excited for me to come back because we were all friends. It was part of the experience for them. But the rules that they applied within that social experience were different rules than I was prepared to experience. And in fact, they all apologized because the moment they could understand I wasn't part of the group where that series of rules of behavior applied, they could change their perspective. Needless to say, they didn't actually say they wouldn't enact those actions that were correct, even though the consequences were different than they expected. But these things are complicated. And I ask you to think through the language in this article, right? Kantianism, which is about rational thought. One example of deontological ethics, we have things that are more obvious deontological ethics, like religious ethics, right? You want a simple example of the deontological ethics? The 10 Commandments are written into the world by God in the religions of the book. Done. You're never supposed to break them. Simple. By the way, nobody actually lives by that. The 10 Commandments are very hard to manage. But theoretically, they are, right? We have lots of kinds of that. And in fact, if you're a Jew versus a Christian, the kind of ethics at play of the 10 Commandments are different because The deontological ethical system in Christianity is what's called an absolute universalism, right? The rules apply to everything across the board. Technically, in Judaism, the Ten Commandments apply to Jews because of a contract between God and the Jews, right? And this is a religious belief that changes how it works, which we're not going to get into now. We can talk about it in office hours if you're interested in the comparative religious effect of that. But these structures between contractarian versus universalist beliefs actually do change how they are implemented and affected, right? Universalism is a very different thing than other kinds because, among other things, universalism changes that comments, that system that we talked about at the beginning. If you have a universalist deontological ethic, and I said always ethics works to be descriptive, evaluative, and directive, or prohibitive and prescriptive. A universalist ethic makes those things the same thing because you have to expect somebody else to act the same way. So somebody who is a hard C Christian, who believes that everybody by definition has to act that way, does not have the same flexibility of system of evaluation of other people's actions that they might have with another system. So we have a rather complicated set of stuff. And one of the two things that we want to keep in mind is, as much as I say that about universalism, we're always looking at universalism or other kinds of ethics nested together with those other things. So we have personal ethics, we have accepted group ethics, we have societal ethics, and we have human or broad universal ethics. So for instance, I'll line them up, but that's okay. These are related, but they're not the same thing. When we go to make a decision, we are literally putting these different things together. We are playing with them, and we have to evaluate how to make and determine that right action then produces an action, an effect that comes after the decision. And all of these things are rather complicated in practice. So one way to think about this is that we often are aware of personal ethics. And we should be aware of accepted and group ethics. And we often forget about societal ethics. But human or broad or universal ethics are also there. And one of the reasons I mention this is they all affect each other. Like nobody's sitting around one day and like, entirely on my own, I believe that cheating is good. I mean, they could, but if somebody just decided that on their own without connecting it to any other system of ethics, that basically makes them crazy. I mean, it isn't the only thing about it that makes them crazy. If you're sitting around and you're like, I think for myself, killing other people is good, that would probably make you crazy. If you do the same thing on personal ethics and it's not a big deal, if you're like, I think it is fundamentally wrong, I just believe deontologically it is the nature of the world that ketchup on a hot dog is wrong. Well, that's the sort of thing you can argue about on the internet. It's not actually going to make people think you're crazy. But ask yourself seriously, those fights on the internet, at some level, you are recognizing a fundamental conflict. Okay. If the outcome effects don't matter, then you're going to be consequentialist about it and say, fuck it, we don't have to agree on that. If it matters because it links to something higher up this chain of effect of ethics, right, then it becomes a big deal. And over the course of the semester, we're going to talk about a number of different structural and possible considerations. For instance, how you can have whatever personal ethic you want, but it tends to be that those affect actions. And so we believe as a society that individual belief is universally allowed. You can have whatever belief you want. The moment it goes from being a stereotype in your head to be a discriminatory action towards somebody else, that is illegal. That's a different thing. And we're living in a world where these things are hard to pay attention to. And when I say we need to start being able to recognize these differences, these are part of it. I see that we're getting close to 1:40. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to just run through a couple of pieces of thing to make sure that they're mentioned. So in that ethical framework, it's going to actually do two different things. And we're going to come back to these concepts later. These say how and why an action can be justified. They also apply a specific set of evaluation criteria. And these are going to be two of the things that come out of this that we're going to talk about in other ways, because this set of ethical thinking, right, is going to define the warrant of something. We often think about warrant in terms of cop shows, where you think of warrant as a piece of paper, but warrant isn't a piece of paper. The warrant for an action is the approval, the correctness of the reason. So in fact, the warrant for the action of a police officer doing something is that they have the right kind of evidence, the probable cause, that the action would be based on the right reasoning. And the piece of paper is literally a judge saying, I checked their reasoning, it's the right reasoning. Does that make sense? But when we're talking about it, we're not talking about a legal structure which has somebody else check your math. We're saying the warrant of something is literally the checking, right? If it has the right kind of reasoning and the reasoning applies, then the action is justified. Similarly, when we say that the right evaluation criteria are applied, we have what's called problem, solution, or question, answer, matching. You cannot come to class and go, you should give me an A because I did really well in calculus. In this class, you could go to calculus class and potentially do that. But in fact, even in the case of the calculus class, if you're like, I'm really good at calculus, and the person goes, did you do your homework? And they're like, no, but I can do it. So that's the important thing. Well, it depends on what the question being asked is. And in fact, often in classes, it isn't enough to know the material. You have to also do the work. And depending on the class, depending on the situation, what problem is being defined and the solution to match it, what question is being defined and the answers are going to be difficult things. But one of the reasons that we have these problems is because everybody's carrying around all this complicated decision-making machinery in their head, right? The heuristics and mental models, right? These are just the ethical ones, but these are actually tied to tons of other things going on And that makes these things complicated. And it's why very specific things, like even ones which don't necessarily make immediate sense to you as being important, like remembering that there is positive and negative, aspirational, structural, etc., ethics, um, it turns out they make a difference because, for example, um, as a note, humans tend to respond differently to positive, negative, aspirational, etc. ethics. And a classic example of this is that people will go out of their way to perform actions that seeks reward um, more often than they will avoid doing an action that is punished. And that is actually a weird thing about humans. Most animals do the opposite. Most animals, if you're like, if you step over that line, you will be shocked. Um, Most animals will never step over the line a second time, or some stupid animals take a couple times to learn, but never do it again. Humans keep fucking with it. Humans will keep poking things even if they get punished. But if you give somebody a reward for not poking their neighbor at school twice, they will tend to do it, tend not to do it. Even though they never get the reward again, people still learn their patterns of behavior based on reward and attachment. Positive reinforcement has a greater tendency to be generalized into behaviors in humans. It's not the only thing that's true, but for example, things are complicated in this way, and so knowing the difference in a positive and negative thing is important, because if you're designing a system encouraging or directing behavior, you're going to want to know whether you're more likely to be doing this. Now, the exception to this, people generally respond better to positive through reward-based systems or encouraging systems, is technologies often don't do this right because they assume this applies to building a technology. If you put an extra button on something and say, your machine will work better if it does this, people don't care. People will still press that button, right? Denying people the ability to press that button, not including functions, etc., is a better way to design machines because you prevent the possibility. And so one of the things to remember is that these ethical rules about behavior don't always work the same way in machines. I think there's a few other things to get through next time, but we did talk a little bit about everything that we wanted to get through, and we'll pick up the rest next time.
Okay, we are trying to get through some basic stuff on this slide. We're going to um, in some ways cover the most of the material that is going to be familiar to you from the lecture, from the reading in the lecture, and then we'll move on to make it a little more complicated. In the lecture, we're talking about ethical frameworks as being a complex system, and that's very different from the traditional philosophical ethics that you saw in the reading. In the reading, with the exception of the complexity around the case of the German chemical company, we are presented with ethics as simple categories. And this is a result of the way that philosophical endeavors work, where they want absolute definitions and stuff. And they don't really talk about something that was mentioned last week, but is really important before you set off. And that is ethics as a subject actually encompasses a number of different things. And you saw this in the slides and in the lecture last time, but we'll do it again. Ethics is always encompassing descriptive aspects, prescriptive aspects, and evaluative functions. And those three things are very different. A descriptive function of ethics is to simply state what can and cannot be right or wrong action. And it describes a process. It can also describe how and in what ways we need to think about ethics. But more importantly, the application of that descriptive process is what's called a prescriptive process, a function where it tells you or someone like you or a person what should and shouldn't be done. And a prescriptive process is based, the word literally means what should be taken, what should be done, but it can as much imply or apply to rules that say what not to do. Ethics, in terms of the prescriptive process, which later we'll talk about, there's a difference, a slight difference between a prescriptive process and a normative process. In a prescriptive process, you say that according to this theory, these simply are or are not the right actions. And that means that it's much simpler when you talk about ethical theory than when you get into a sociological perspective where we're talking about context and complexity. And in that point, we can have normative ethics. Now, a normative ethic is like a prescriptive ethic. It tells you what to do, what not to do. But in a normative ethic, we're deriving that based on the expectation of a group or a society, as opposed to on a formal theory of ethics. And in contrast to either of those two kinds of prescriptive ethics, the evaluative function is when you look at someone else's ethics and you can determine whether those ethics, those actions, those decisions are right or wrong. And we have to remember, among other things, that within our larger ethical framework, we can have, in fact, different functions, different ethics to be used in different ways. One of the classic examples of this is that we often refer back to moral theories, cultural theories in trained learning to do descriptive work. What is or is not right or wrong can be based on those general descriptions of the nature of the world that morals speak to. But when we actually look at an individual in a specific situation, it's very difficult to think of those general statements as applying. And this is why last week, when we were talking about the difference between moral and ethical, I made a particular point of it. We never want to forget that, much like our evaluation of technology, much like our discussion of context embeddedness and context dependence, ethics in practice will always be responsive to the context. They're not going to be the same thing in one or the other situations. And the reason for that is that regardless of your theory, you're never only looking at one ethical rule, one ethical theory. You're always going to be balancing multiples or multiple elements within an ethical theory. And the same is true when we look at evaluating other people's actions. You can say what you did is wrong, but you actually have to know why it's wrong. And you have to be able to think of the ways that it is supportable within your theory or your explanation to say it's wrong. So ethics covers those different things. It covers a descriptive function, a prescriptive or a normative function, if you're talking about a normative system of ethics as opposed to an individual or philosophical ethics, and it's evaluative. It's used to determine or describe whether someone else's actions are correct. And those are all relatively complicated. So ethics act to label right actions in all those functions, or at the same time to label wrong actions. But that labeling function is very different when you're talking about trying to decide in your decision making, what should I do, as opposed to retrospectively evaluating someone else's actions that have already been done. They work differently. And over the course of the semester, we'll talk about the differences there, because how you communicate and how you structure ethical arguments have to be done differently when you have the ideally good knowledge of your own theory of ethics, good knowledge of your own reasoning, as opposed to when you are trying to produce an argument for somebody else, in the case of an evaluative statement for somebody else's actions or decisions. And in the reading, we don't get a lot of that sort of explanation. It jumps directly to talking about the variations in formal ethical theories, deontological, consequentialist. In the reading, I have this little chart here I pulled off the web. from somebody else's class. They talk about subjectivism. Subjectivism is actually a mean way of describing this idea of normative ethics, that there are expectations and conceptions of ethical demands that other people place on you, and that you can interpret and fight about those things in personal ways. So when we're talking about that, we're actually acknowledging the social world. And this chart is choosing to say those things fall outside of philosophy, which is true. It's a chart that is in a philosophy textbook, presumably. Consequentialism and deontological ethics are the two that the article focuses on. And for example, when we talk about the example of Robin Hood and say Robin Hood is either doing something wrong because he's breaking a general you shouldn't steal, or he's doing something right because the consequences of his effect help more people than they hurt. We're either effectively paying attention to the action itself or the consequences. And in the reading, they do talk about Kant and the idea of a rationalist ethic and of the moral imperatives that are derived from it. And they use an example here of a deontological ethic. And in the article, they don't really explain what that word deontological means, but it's worth knowing. Deontological means of ontology or from ontology. And what that means is it comes from the nature of the world, right? So you're not saying exactly the same thing as you say in a moral statement, because in a moral statement, you're just describing how one should understand the world. Don't do this because that's the nature of the world. In a deontological ethic, you're saying there is a rule for action that makes that kind of action right or wrong. And the classic example of this in the article is the Kant's description of a moral imperative of reflection. And there's a fancier name for it in Kantian philosophy, but reflection makes sense. And we will use that as a momentary example. So Kant says we need not know anything complicated to get on ethics. We know the nature of our own minds. And all of us don't like negative experiences. Sometimes they say pain, but in this day and age, sometimes students go, well, some people like pain. In his discussion, pain is just something you don't want, something you feel viscerally and personally is bad. So Kant says, look, we all know we don't want pain, and rationally we can presume that other people don't want pain also. Similarly, I know that when I'm angry because somebody has inflicted pain on me, I have an urge to cause pain to them. At least a momentary one that you may or may not ever want to act on. And in having that urge, we can recognize another rational tendency. That is, when pain happens, it tends to be reflected back on the person. And that means that we can then logically say, I do not want pain. If I act on other people who have similar experiences, those people's pain will cause them to make me pain. And because I don't want that pain in response, the generalizable rule derived from the nature of the world, of the human condition, is do not cause pain to others, because that would be it. But he actually can generalize one step further and say this tends to be true for other kinds of experiences. So he says we should act towards others in a way that, if reflected on ourselves, would be desirable. And that version of the golden rule is an interesting one because, among others, it tends to be similarly represented in other religions and other ethical theories. Often, though the translation can be variable, we can find a version of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, in all of the major world religions, ranging across the religions of the book, and even in some of the Mesoamerican religions we know stuff about, into some of the versions of Buddhism. All around the world, ethical theories have used versions of this, and it turns out it's not justified in many cases, like Kant's is, by the nature of the world being about the human mind. It's justified by a different thing. But it's always a deontological ethic based on this is the way the world works. It demands that this is the correct way to act. And that's very different from the consequentialist approaches, which, for instance, we're going to say social utilitarianism or Bentham's original utilitarianism are good examples. Utilitarianism is an example of a consequentialist approach. Different consequentialisms use different measures of outcome. In utilitarianism, we measure the benefit. We subtract the negative parts. And in traditionally Jeremy Bentham's original utilitarian one, he said we measure happiness. And one of the problems is we can define happiness in a lot of different ways. But John Stuart Mills came back and he modified happiness to describe social stability, social inclusion, and stuff like that. And it becomes social utilitarianism as opposed to classical utilitarianism. And in any case, we're going to say that the outcome of the event is the important thing, and then we need, as a result, to work through the process of measuring outcomes. Consequentialism has the great advantage of being measurable. We can justify, assuming everybody accepts the measuring device, the heuristic, we can justify and explain ethical evaluation based on the data. And consequentialist logics have been, in ethics, have been increasingly popular over the 20th century. Deontological ethics have the incredible advantage over consequentialists that you don't have to do research. The problem is it's very hard to get people to agree on them outside of a shared group belief. Now on the chart, it mentions ethical egoism, which is in fact mentioned in the text. I want to argue that there is no real argument for ethical egoism. Ethical egoism says the consequence, the effect that we measure is how good something is towards myself. I am the only person I can know about and the only person that's important, so we don't have to measure effects to other people. If it's good for me, it's good. This is from a philosophical standpoint, it is a discredited logic. It is also a very popular one with people today. So it's on that chart. I don't object to it, but understand in this class you will not be able to justify egoism, ethical egoism, or self-rational egoism or objectivism as ethical formats. They're not good theories. Now, the next and last thing for this slide is I will mention, as they were mentioned in the reading, virtue ethics are in fact somewhat popular and increasingly popular, both in philosophy and in real life. They're a bad set of theory. Virtue ethics basically say a good person does good acts, and in theory, a virtue ethic has a mechanism for evaluating, revising the character and virtue of a person. It never works like that. Philosophers keep allowing virtue ethics to be a good philosophy because they don't pay attention to history. But I tell you, as a historian and a sociologist, virtue ethics have always arisen out of group dominance. Rich people today get to say, I make good decisions, I am a good person because I say so, because I have a power to say so. And we'll notice that on the news, right? A rich person is assumed to be good until right after they get convicted of a crime, whereas poor people are sort of assumed to be making bad decisions. They cheat, they steal, because there is an unwritten system of virtue ethics that go into effect. They are bad ethics and you should avoid them. One of the central functions of ethical theory is in fact to be able to explain why one ethical theory is better than another. And the simple answer is unless you actually have a good basis for describing and evaluating every individual on earth by their virtue, virtue ethics break down. And nobody does. We don't have a good system for that. And if you want to see how an extension of virtue ethics becomes technology, there have been fights about the development of a social cohesion metric, virtue ethics, within the numerical categorization of somebody in China in the last couple of years, which has not been seen as a good thing. So we're going to move on to talk more about ethical functions and about other things, but we can spend a little time talking about these in office hours. I encourage you to come talk to me. And the other thing that, oh, I apologize. The other thing that I'll mention is within these larger theories, there are actually lots of little pieces, and that's what's going to be talked about in the next slide. There's a lot of stuff on this slide, but this is going to be a very quick note, which is to say that for all kinds of ethics, we need to make sure that we're talking about the right thing, right? We're talking about the right level. If you're talking about an ethical rule that applies to everything, you have to think about everything. If you're talking about an ethical rule that talks about some small thing, you can focus on a small thing. If you're using a consequentialist ethic, a utilitarian ethic, an outcome-based ethic, how big a consequence? As we move through this semester, we'll see that there are different ways to think about it. 1 month, 6 month, a year, 10-year. The scale can be time-based. One city, one state, one country, everybody on Earth. It can be scale of population. We can talk about the literal amount of land, right? A geographic. Do we have to worry about the oceans if we're talking about people? Well, people don't really go to the oceans. Decide to bound or limit, decide to expand or increase the scale and the scope. The scale is literally big or small in whatever way you mean it, and the scope is what is included or left out. These are demarcations. They're drawing of boundaries. And it's a key skill in the social sciences. It's a key skill that we do. And one way to think about it is going back to the idea of politics. If the people that you're talking about are everybody who's going to be affected, nobody else could be affected, that's great. But often you want to keep in mind who the affected groups are. And at the same time, which people have an ability to act or not act, which ones are implicated. That is, their choices influence the outcome. Now we can come back and talk about scale and scope and attention. We'll do that a bunch of times this semester, but I just wanted to bring it up, put it into the back of your heads today. Hi, so within ethics, within any one of those theories, there can be some simplicity, but the reality is that every person carries around multiple systems of ethics. There are some things, especially what we might talk about as boundary aspects of ethics, where you say, look, I have an absolute rule about this. It limits some things. It's just the way the world is. For many people, for example, it's do not kill. And then you have to say, well, sometimes, even though you shouldn't kill, even though killing makes the wrong action, it may be necessary. And then I'll try and have a consequentialist approach to evaluate how wrong it is or what to do about that in terms of sort of self-defense. And so inside of the general rule, you'll have another different theory of ethics. And even within those complex interchanges of multiple ethics, one system of ethics may have many rules, many guidelines, many principles, depending on which language we use. And when we talk about an ethical rule, there are actually different kinds of rules, directions of right action. And they function in different ways. It functions generally as descriptive, directive, prohibitive, evaluative, but the general theory contains specific guidelines, rules, traits that have different names. So for instance, a positive and negative ethic, those are literally statements that say this is good, this is bad action. And often we'll use the fancy terms. Something is prescriptive, one ought to do it, one should do this. Prohibitive or prescriptive, proscriptive, are don't do this, one ought not to do that. And we can think of them as, in strong cases, as bans on action and requirements for action. And those are the most common forms of ethical rules, right? They are It can be very general, very specific. You may have multiple that overlap. So, for instance, you should not cheat. You should work to get the highest grade. You should achieve the most important things in the class. The exams are important. The exams aren't important. Lots of different rules you learn over time. Some of them are ethical. Some of them are cultural or moral. And we can struggle with those. Positive and negative rules can even apply at the same time, because you may have a positive rule that says to act a certain way, and then the inverse, the negative rule that says not to do the opposite. One of the classic examples of this is one should be honest. One should not lie. And you may have both of those as key functions, that both rules that have function because they actually describe something slightly differently, right? And they produce a space of action. A positive rule, one should be honest, encourages you to add information, to share information, to think of what kind of thing is involved in honesty. The negative rule, the prohibition against lying, says the information you provide, the framing, it should be truthful. It shouldn't be a lie. And between them, they actually do a better job than either rule on its own. Now, next class or somewhere in the semester, we'll have a longer conversation about the philosophical concept of honesty here, because it turns out that these ethical rules applying to honesty are a really good example of this complexity. When we move on to the next form of trait or tenet or rule or guideline or principle, we're talking about something that is rarely talked about but very important, which are structural ethics. Often we think of ethics as being about very important things because either they're deontological, because they have big nature of the world support. Don't kill because human life has value. And by comparison, consequentialists will tend to evaluate, measure, do the work of consequentialism for big important things. And that means that some things slide around in between. Structural ethics are demands that arise because of the systems or because of other ethics. And the classic example of this mentioned last week is what's called a transparency ethic, right? So technically, transparency is different from honesty because transparency is not just showing the final information that somebody is entitled to, it's showing all the information or all the process along the way so that somebody can evaluate the reliability of the information. Transparency is basically never a good in and of itself. It just produces more information, it slows down the process, but it turns out that in huge numbers of situations, transparency makes other more important things functional. Right, so you need to know how voting works, how the votes are counted, how to vote, who is voting, all sorts of stuff that would easily be forgotten or hidden if you didn't have a demand for transparency and democracy. Transparency is not in and of itself ethically demanded by almost everybody, but something you do think is important, democracy, may demand transparency of process. Similarly, we want as a scientific goal, as a normative ethic in our culture, that science is useful. Science is the way to do things. We need information to have sources and mechanisms of evaluation. And that means, again, if you like science, transparency is necessary. Not because science is good or bad. I mean, once you accept science, you have to accept transparency. And so these are structural ethics, and they are complicated. And most of the time you will forget about them. But in fact, particularly for large-scale technology development, these are important. When we look at structural ethics, we can look at a large-scale technology and say, look, if you look at one use of that technology, this is not a big deal. If you look at the large-scale technology, it is a big deal. And that's where structural ethics really are important in engineering, right? So for instance, the use of alternative power sources is great. We want to replace fossil fuels, but in order to get the rare earth elements to produce high quality solar panels and storage batteries, we actually have to use so much fuel. We have to have caused so much environmental damage. We have to use so much work that it may, at a larger scale, actually be harmful to make the transition without taking into account a demand that wouldn't be part of the final calculation, right, of what we started out looking at. And so there are processes like transparency and like expansion of perspective that are necessary when we do that larger scale stuff that engineers aspire to do. I choose aspire there because aspirational rules are the next one on the list. An aspirational ethic is not saying this action in particular is good or bad. It's not saying that this action in particular is producing a good outcome or a bad outcome. It's not saying that this action is good or bad because the nature of the world says so. An aspirational ethic says this is the right way to do it. It is a good action. It is a right action because it is productive towards, it is moving us towards making the future the way that we want it to be. Right? So one of the classic examples in lots of historical moments have been saying forgiving your enemy may not help anything right now, but producing the kind of world where people are forgiving is important. And in fact, aspirational ethics are particularly important in engineering because, as I said at the beginning, the whole purpose of an engineer, of having the profession of engineering, is to be able to build something that is making a better world in the future. And that works in two ways. One, obviously the world would be great if everybody could make anything they want. So there is a negative. We then have to have a justification for making a negative, right? And if you're a consequentialist, that justification could be calculated in many ways. If you're a deontological person, you might be able to say, no, there's just something fundamentally about some people that makes them better engineers. The issue there is what we actually want to use to justify that is because we can look at how past and present situations are producing an effect, responding to deontological demands. And we actually want to just say, look, having a group of people who are promising to do this well is making the kind of future we want. And at a later date, we can come back to this and talk about how the aspirational ethic in engineering works. Now, the other thing that we should mention here is that, like I said, all ethics are going to be applied in context, in situations, and both engineering ethics as a specific field and ethics in general often doesn't spend enough time teaching how to pay attention to situations, right? So situational versus general measurements means that we actually do need to pay attention to whether the measurements we're using are the right ones. And we'll keep coming back to this in the form of question and answer, solution and problem matching as we go. Now, this is most obvious when we're looking at the consequentialist approaches that require measurement at a basic level, but it's true of all of them. We have to know we're applying the right outcomes, the right rules, the right principles, because even if you're using a deontological ethic, you may have multiple rules that apply. And if you use one, there may be others that are just as important that you're not thinking about. And so thinking about situations in complex ways is important. I realize now that I have placed the slide wrong way, so I've been talking about the right slide. The left slide is this discussion of duties and obligations, and I do think it is worth mentioning this. in the textbook, it often mentions duties related to deontological ethics. They are particularly important there. They're not limited to it. Um, I mentioned the obligation arising from a voluntary ethic, like professional ethics in engineering, but we actually are talking about a fundamental duty. So a duty is something that arises from and stays connected to a fundamental part of the thing, right? So the profession of engineering is built, it stays connected to. You no longer have that duty if you stop being an engineer, but as long as you're an engineer, you have that duty, and it can never end. An obligation, on the other hand, is a specific active requirement. It demands that something is done, and when that thing is done, the obligation ends. So you could say duties are a subcategory of permanent, semi-permanent obligation, or you can just think of them as separate things. It is a difficult one because in our common language and colloquial use, we tend to use them interchangeably. And duties and obligations are not the same as rules, right? Rules apply to either prevent or promote an action. In ethical thinking, the rules, which are there, they stand there and they do their thing, but they're not changing. A duty is always renewing because you are still the kind of person, you are still the profession, you are still whatever that is there. All humans have X duty because they're human. It doesn't go away. And it always should be pushing towards certain kinds of decisions, but it doesn't tell you in a specific decision what to do. Similarly, an obligation sits there and you know that you owe something to someone, to something, but the obligation doesn't tell you how to pay it back in most cases, and the moment it's paid back, it's gone. So it's a different kind of thing. Now, as they're telling us that the engineer has this responsibility, has to pay attention to this, I think it's worth going back to the definition of engineering. And I think one of the things that often people forget is that engineering is not just making things. Engineering is the production or attempt to produce an expected and knowable outcome. That is the effect, the artifact that is made. The engineering is not, in fact, the making the thing. It is the being able to produce a plan and a purpose towards an outcome, and that and generally a known or intended effect, right? So if you don't know what's going to happen, by definition, you're not engineering. And Matheson Gray's argument is that very often traditional engineering points people towards a situation where they're only predicting some of the effects. And so their argument that the effects of engineered things, that the effects of technology has these long-term political effects, is not about changing what engineers do. It is about saying that engineers, because of the nature of engineering, already have an obligation to do this and simply need to do it better. Um, it is entirely possible that great engineers are aware of these things, but Matheson Gray, as both professional engineers and observers, ask us to take into account that often the tools and attentions of engineers mean that they are not good at this kind of attention.
Happy to start the lecture proper. There is a difference between a profession and a job. And in fact, we used to have language in the United States and in English to differentiate those things by, among other things, the word occupation or vocation or profession. And the term profession actually doesn't come from being a job. The word profession comes from having been a member of what were called the professions. That is a class of people who were recognized as not simply having a job. And in fact, historically, there were only about 4 professions in England where the word and the concept comes from. Doctors and engineers weren't really one of them. Doctors were one of them, lawyers were one of them. apologize. I may have to get the door in a moment. My doorbell just rang, but no, somebody else is getting it. The um, the the basis of the professions were that they weren't people who simply had jobs. They were people who had been invested in the public trust. And so we can think of the difference between a job, that is an occupation, a way to spend time. That is literally what the word occupation means, something that occupies your time. And the difference in that and a profession is that an occupation is simply about how you spend time. But a profession is something that in order to do that, you need to hold the trust of the people you do it for. And the classic example of this is doctors, right? You can think of a doctor and you go, if you don't trust a doctor, do you think that he can do his job or she can do their job? If you don't really trust them, and I don't mean just as an individual, if you don't trust doctors, do you think medicine works properly? No, not really, right? And often we forget to make that association with the idea of professions being reliant on trust in engineering also, but the nature of professions are always reliant on that. And it's not a matter of trust as we would simply talk about it most of the time, where you as a person trust. The nature of responsibility of a profession is that you wouldn't have the right to do that if you were not trusted. Think of the difference between, for example, a mechanic or a hobbyist and a professional engineer, right? We know that there's a difference between them. And part of that is that they represent the profession, right? They have a license, they have a title, they have a thing, those aspects of the profession that define them as a member. But it's not just that they are different. A licensed engineer is, in fact, given privileges, rights as a member of the profession. Now, you guys actually, even though you're studying to be engineers in some cases, may not know what those rights are, and we can come back to that at a later time. We're just going to use this example from medicine because you'll be familiar with it. No one else can prescribe medicine besides an MD. I mean, technically, there are a few other kinds of medical degree now that are recognized in the profession, like RNs, but technically they're supposed to be oversight by MDs. Only doctors get to prescribe medicine. So here's the thing that happens. As we develop a profession, we invest it with trust, and that trust takes the form of a monopoly right, an exclusive right. And engineers have these. Different forms of engineers are the ones who can do it. So for instance, it is illegal to build a building and have electric lines in it and use electricity without an engineer signing off on it. They have an exclusive right to them, right? Different kinds of engineers have different exclusive rights because we've subdivided and specialized the fields. And we can have a longer discussion in another time about why, in fact, computer programming was on track to become a profession. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, they shut that shit down because nobody wanted to have a specialized, highly paid profession around it. And so we ended up with a very complex thing where technically there are no professional computer designers in the traditional sense of professions. There is no licensure. There is no exclusive right. Any kid in a garage can go out and become a computer programmer. And that is a different thing. So the Harris textbook talks about this in particular because we want to understand why engineering ethics are so important. And the answer is we as a society, not as technical professionals, like everybody in the society looked around the world at more or less at about the same time, really from about 1900 until 1950. And the reality was that while there was professional engineering before 1900, at around the same time that a lot of the other professions, including medicine, were professionalizing between 1900 and 1950, engineering did it. So in the same period of time, we decided as a society that people needed to be able to trust the folks making technologies, designing buildings, building bridges. And it's hard for you to imagine your grandparents' generation, what life would have been like. For instance, Robert Moses, who you guys read about last week in the example, one of the most important urban planners in the United States, and personally designed, he didn't do all the calculations and stuff, but personally designed bridges, skyscrapers, highways, had no formal education in the matter. None. The trust that was placed in him was largely placed in him because of the politics of who he knew and how successful past projects were. But in reality, there was no external point that allowed the trust to be formed. And in many cases, as recently as, if you're slightly older than you probably are, your grandparents' generation, or if your grandparents had kids late, your grandparents' generation, about 80 to 90 years ago, half of the bridges built in the United States were built by amateurs. And I don't mean like little bridges. I mean like big river spanning bridges. And that meant that there were a lot of bridges falling down. Guns could be made by anybody. Cars could be made by anybody. There was no oversight. There were no processes of certainty. And that meant that railroads exploded and things fell apart and people died. And by 1925, people had had enough of that shit, and they started producing licensures and external checks so that there would be a greater public trust. And in exchange for that, in exchange for limiting who could practice it and saying that you needed to do things the right way, they were limited and they produced a profession. And that meant that professionals got paid better. But it also meant that other people were excluded. And that's how professions develop. Over time, as you need more and more people do it, because we have more and more technologies, because there are more specializations, you get more diverse professions, right? Remember that everybody was just an engineer until basically the 1940s, at which point so much electrical stuff happened and so much chemical stuff happened that to some extent you just stopped being all mechanical engineers and started to have to teach electrical engineers and chemical engineers separately. And in the last 60 to 70 years, believe it or not, there are engineers still practicing today who are old and crotchety, who existed in a world where there were not separate specializations of engineering. The oldest engineering college in the country, the first technical education program in the country, goes back to 1824, and it was Rensselaer, where I went not in an engineering capacity. But believe it or not, Rensselaer, our RPI, much like the actual oldest engineering program in the country at the U.S. Army College of West Point, engineering literally was just a military specialization. It was about a certain set of skills you couldn't trust non-military folks to have. And it was about recognizing and extending those skills into civilian capacities, such as the use of drainage ditches, mining, and tunneling, because doing it all as amateurs seemed to get too many people killed. That led to RPI and then led to other forms of professionalization. So individual responsibility may be great, but the entire purpose of a profession was to build up a system of it. And one of the things that happens with this system is that because it exists as a public trust system, we have to recognize that it produces a different set of obligations. And we'll come back in a minute to me just talking about ethical systems and ethical frameworks. That was the main point of the readings for you guys in Donaldson and Worrying. But the thing is that when you have an external structure, we change how we talk about ethics, right? Because this is no longer what you believe matters. It's what's called an accepted or involuntary. Now, if you want to be nice, you say it's accepted. You choose to do it. And if you're like me and you're just like, I don't care what you think, it's an involuntary obligation. The moment that you are an engineer, the moment that you are Um, accepting the licensure or accepting the role of an engineer, you no longer have a choice except to live up to those engineering ethics. It is an involuntary ethic. And that means that when we talk about professional engineering, it's actually very different than when, for instance, we could talk about the engineering similar to engineering ethics, but non-engineering ethics of a profession like, let's say, computer programming or acupuncture. Right? In the United States, acupuncture is a non-licensed profession. In China, by the way, it is a licensed profession because they want to change the public trust and modify the conception of it and be able to license and regulate it. In the US, some states regulate it, but most states don't. Most states go, it's pseudoscience. We don't do that. Somebody else can figure that out. There are even some states where it is just straight up illegal to charge somebody for doing it. And you can choose a different example, but there's a difference between an established profession like engineering, where you automatically have to follow those rules. Now, the thing about that is many people don't. Many people who are professional engineers, even licensed engineers, don't really follow the rules of what it means to be an engineer, and that causes problems. And so as we move into the discussion of engineering ethics, I will emphasize two of the categories of ethics that are not in Donaldson and Worrain. Now, in Donaldson and Worrain, we are really presented with a fairly straightforward, simplistic view of ethics. And that simplistic view of ethics.
So this is the whiteboard from class last year. When I taught this lecture, and I decided that I'd put it up and you can sort of imagine me standing in front of it. Normally I use two case examples to do this discussion. The first of them is a silly little example. It's in some ways an alternative to talking about Robin Hood. And then the second is we walk through the case study in the Harris to talk about the Challenger space shuttle explosion. And I'm not going to do an entire hour long. Usually that's the second day of the week for the discussion period, and we'll do a breakout of it. I thought about doing an exercise with the for the online class, but I know that managing lots of things for you guys is hard. I'm just going to talk about it for a minute after I do the first of the examples. So the first of the examples, what I often say is the example of the lazy cop and the young cop. And we use this example, I use this example to get at a couple of the ideas that we've talked about throughout this lecture. Try and imagine a situation. Two police officers are walking the beat, and one of them has been on the force for 20 years. He's almost retired, and he no longer cares. Whether he is a good person or a bad person is unimportant. What we need to know now is that he acts based on his experiences without thinking and decision-making being careful. The other cop is a new cop who is young and excited and is desperately trying to do everything correctly. So we might, instead of talking about them as the lazy cop and the young cop, we could think of them as the not intentional, the non-reflexive cop. He works on instinct or on repetition of prior experiences, versus the new cop who is working reflexively, intentionally, and carefully. And part of the reason that we're doing that, using these two examples, is to see the distinction between decision making and action and how it can make it complicated in different ethics. So lazy cop, walking along a beat he's walked along 100 times, and young cop walking it for the first time or walking down the street, and they realize that it's about time for lunch, and they come to a bodega on the corner, and fat lazy cop, who looks, usually I say, imagine me in a police uniform, says, "Kid, go on inside and get me lunch." And the kid goes inside, And the fat, lazy cop smokes a cigarette even though he's not supposed to smoke in uniform. And he leans against a car and he doesn't pay much attention. And the kid walks inside being very careful, following the book. He looks around the store and he walks towards the front. And as he gets to the counter to place his order at the little grocery, he realizes that the guy at the counter has hidden his gun but is trying to rob the store. Now, the burglar, standing there, realizes that the cop has walked in. The cop doesn't have his gun out, begins to identify himself as a police officer and order the guy to surrender, and the guy shoves past him, runs out the door. And because the kid was trying to follow every rule and do it properly, he didn't manage to stop the guy. He did interrupt unintentionally the robbery and prevent the completion of the robbery, but because he didn't make a threat, he approached the situation correctly and didn't intensify or potentially challenge the guy in a way that would make him shoot. The kid gets knocked down and the burglar runs out. The fat, lazy cop, I'm standing outside and I'm annoyed my lunch is being slow. So as I stand there, the door swings open and the surprised burglar, who did not expect another cop to come out, comes running out the door and slams right into me. And I knock him down. And his gun goes flying off to the side, and thinking purely about the fact that some asshole has bumped into me, I kick the shit out of the guy on the street and incidentally or accidentally capture the burglar. Now, we have a series of events where in each case the decision-making process has a different outcome than we would expect. The guy who's doing everything right, attempting to follow the law, attempting to follow procedure, fails to have an outcome he wants. He ends up harmed by being knocked down, and he does not stop the burglar from leaving. The cop on the outside, who is intentionally shirking his duties, he's not paying attention, and he acts out of anger to harm the guy, unintentionally produces a situation where a dangerous criminal has been apprehended, but he didn't do it because he was following the law. He didn't do it because he was following procedure. He did it because he was angry somebody bumped into him. And part of what we want to get out of this example is the complexity of matching hard-to-know decisions to actions and then outcomes. If we're going to look at consequentialist purely on the outcomes, the best production of outcomes follows and says these police officers did something right. The criminal who has attempted to harm something has basically done nothing wrong, if we're saying, because all he did was scare people, but his action was still negative because it did scare the guy, didn't have a positive outcome to balance that out. We can follow that through. If we're looking at deontological ethics, then we might say that the person who did the good action was the kid who got knocked down and didn't do anything. Even though his action was ineffective, he did intend it to be proper and according to good duties, to follow through on his duty as a police officer, his duty as a person. All those things, they're right. And so when we look at this in terms of deontological versus consequentialist ethics, we're going to have problems. But we also will have a really hard time differentiating the actions and the decisions, right? Does the kicking the guy while he's down as an action constitute the same decision as the one to handcuff him and arrest him for the burglary? Does it make the same decision matter? If we look at the different sets of decisions and actions in that case, we have some difficult challenges. I tend to think that everybody there is wrong, all actions are wrong, and all outcomes are potentially wrong also. But when we look at an example in the real world, we're often looking at a case where different kinds of actions and different kinds of decisions connect to each other in a way that makes it difficult to analyze. And so what we're going to end up doing in this case, or in any case, is drawing lines. We're going to demarcate or differentiate the different things. So when we do an analysis, you're going to analyze the intention, as well as we can document it, of each person. The burglar intended to rob the store. His action was to threaten the guy in the store. The effects may not have been significant. Maybe the guy's gotten used to being robbed. Maybe he's traumatized for life. We can evaluate and determine in the case what those effects are. Those sequence of things are those. We might need to add in, he did not look where he's going out the door. Another case of decision-making failure producing an action, opening the door and slamming into the cop outside. We can keep breaking it up, and we can actually diagram them out. And I'm sorry that we're not in the whiteboard. I'm not going to diagram them for you, but you can think of it. The young cop had this series of decisions, this series of actions, and you can start separating them out. You can ask questions and try and fill in details, and eventually you'll be able to determine how those sequences of decision-making and actions and effects look when you apply different ethics. Now, in that case, we have a hypothetical and a sort of silly one potentially, even though it's a moment in time where we want to take police violence seriously. The case that we use in the Harris book with the Challenger explosion is a little different, and I think that it's worth spending a few more minutes on it. What ends up happening is pressure from NASA, from an engineering company, from a number of different sources, directs or influences the actions of a set of engineers, in particular Baggioli, who's the chief engineer on this design team at the engineering firm that has made this engine setup. And when we look through this whole case of the Challenger explosion, one of the things is that each person in the case actually has multiple demands placed on them, multiple roles, multiple ethics. So for today, with the abbreviated version, I'll use 3 people. We have the engineer who's in charge of the case, and then we have the engineer in charge of the engineering team. Sorry, the managing engineer who's in charge of the whole thing, the engineer who's in charge of the engineering team, and we're going to add a third person who is the commander on the space flight. And the commander on the space flight has ultimate decision over whether he presses the launch button. But his decision is entirely based on information provided by other people. So he is reliant on the trust he places in professionals. On top of that, while he is the commander of the space shuttle, he is also a normal human being with a child and with family who wants to survive. And so he has a set of expectations and of reasons that are his personal ones. He has a set of them that are his professional ones. And then he's also got learned normative expectations from his time in the military. He's got a set of expectations based on his bosses at NASA who want the launch to take off. There have been previous launches scrubbed for bad weather that didn't launch. And so in the end, he is making a decision where he says, all the rest of this stuff says the consequences of canceling the flight outweigh the risks if the information that's given to me is correct. And so he chooses to launch the spaceship. At the same time, you have the 2 people at the engineering company who worked as contractors for NASA. One of them is primarily a manager, one of them is primarily an engineer, and the primary engineer says, I have to only answer this question, is it safe to launch, as an engineer, and says the risks cannot be said to be unimportant. The risks are too high. And when asked to say exactly how high they are, he says, as an engineer, I cannot do that. It would be dishonest. The risk is significant, but we don't have the data to say exactly what that risk is. And when asked if he wasn't an engineer, would he be able to tell us that? He says, look, you asked me to take my engineering hat off. The reality is that not as an engineer, it's probably very small. But as an engineer, without the data to actually be able to answer that question, I can't give you an answer. The manager, who is also a trained engineer, but he is acting as a manager, setting aside the idea that data in the way that engineers should be deciding these things, says, look, as a manager, that's the answer I wanted to hear, that it is a small risk. And he says, go ahead. These communication channel breakdown means that, again, those structural requirements for transparency and honesty, nobody is lying. But the sequence of events means that the person on the space shuttle who has to make the final decision gets information that is inaccurate because he doesn't know how the assessment was relied upon. And so we can look at this and see a variety of different decisions leading to actions, leading to effects, and how multiple complex interactions within the ethical framework lead to them. Okay, so in the Donaldson and Worrain article, they mention a few other things, but the core case, the core example that they ask you to think about using the ideas of traditional ethics is this example of the chemical company, BASF. This is loosely based on a real company. It's a German company and looking for a new factory facility in the United States. It is examining the possibility of placing that factory in South Carolina upriver from a protected wetlands area in a region where how to make the decision is complicated. If they are environmentally friendly, costs go up. If they're not environmentally friendly, then they could be causing significant damage. The kinds of effects that they have, both financial effects, that is responding to the what's called the fiduciary duty to their shareholders and board, is to provide the greatest profit and the best possible outcome based on business interests. But they also have a duty as human beings, as members of the human species. They have a duty under law to follow laws, including environmental laws, including safe practices laws. They have both a financial interest and a moral or an ethical interest in locating the factory someplace where there will be workers who will work there, right? Not only because they have this financial interest, they want workers to be able to work there. They don't want a factory with no workers, but they also would theoretically recognize that there are other demands. Placement of that factory affects people's lives. And in the example, it's particularly abstract perhaps in the way it's written, but what I've placed on the slide here is a couple of examples so you can see sort of where the areas we're talking about, right? The part of South Carolina that we're talking about, anywhere we place it has high unemployment. But you'll notice that those islands down at the bottom, the islands that we're talking about, the protected wetlands, where Beaufort is, where Horsehead Island is, and Hilton Head, down at the bottom there of that map on the left, that's the lowest unemployment pretty much in the state, right? The areas that have tourism, that are reliant on tourism, and that are located where the potential economic and social reason for the factory to be needed is lowest, are the areas which are most likely to have their environmental issues damaged. And one of the things that that's asking is then what scale of analysis that you're going to put on it. Because if you're looking at it purely from the factory point of view, not caring how it affects the state, not caring how it affects the people, then the fact that you could potentially place it upriver from there is good. The fact that there will almost certainly be some sort of environmental harm to that area, reducing the economic and social quality of the state, that may not be in your best interest, or it may be in your best interest. So as you look at the case, one of the things that we can do in class is discuss the realities, the certainties, the possibilities, how each of many different ethical obligations, ethical concerns, or theories would lead us through that BASF case. Now, a few minutes ago, I talked very briefly about what it is that's interesting and important about the Challenger space shuttle disaster. And I wanted to take a little more time to expand that this semester and add a little more. When we look at the case studies that we look at, there are often a million different cases we could choose, but the case studies that I'm providing you with, there's always a rationale. And the use of the case study in the textbook is specific. It's become a classic for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons that is somewhat problematic is that for engineers or people within the community of engineers, not necessarily all engineers, but many of them, it's an example of where subjective bias, that is, where non-technical elements produce an ethical problem as opposed to a disagreement within the engineering or technical analysis. Right? If you just get the math wrong, that's one thing. But if you're, working on the math and then there are this complex things, those become something outside of what engineers are taught to handle. And in particular, this case, because there are several layers and elements of subjective bias, of cultural embeddedness, of institutional thinking, whether you're going to focus on the what sometimes gets called groupthink or siloing or communication barrier between different communities. Back, 10, 15 years ago, this would have often been called the Dilbert effect or the nerd management conflict, where the level of expertise of some members of a business or of an organization requires that they think and talk differently than another community in the group. And this is one of the central elements that happens in the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, is that one group is talking about something, and because they're talking to another group, there is a translation process, and individuals within the community of people at NASA, at Morton Thiokol, at the NASA Space Center, they are able to both intentionally and unintentionally misunderstand or misrepresent what's happening in the communication of ideas. And so the subjective bias issue, this cultural embeddedness issue of all engineering, becomes very visible because those communications issues are central to it. It's also a classic case study because it was so highly visible, right? This is long before your time, but I was an elementary school student watching this launch on television when the space shuttle blew up. It was a very public and, importantly, an undeniable harm. In many case studies, especially when they're being analyzed in terms of consequences, one can in fact argue both ways, right? When we get to the Pinto case and other cases later, we'll talk about how we measure costs and benefits, or harms and benefits, produces different analyses. But there is no measurement system for the consequences of this explosion that would allow it to be really seen as in any way positive. Even the goals that were directing people to their decisions do not produce positive outcomes for the people who were making mistakes, who were making bad decisions. And that means that it's a nice, arguably black and white case, because you don't have to consider whether somebody's different perspective on the ethics might have allowed them to consider the event a different thing. And in the title of the slide, I have this subtitle that says a critical unfavorable incident or outcome or a disaster. And that one of the things that's interesting about this is that the farther back in time it gets, the less charged or publicly traumatic or painful or critical the explosion is for people who read it. And we get this very formal language, which is now occasionally used, and that especially as we move to less publicly and universally recognized harms, that we can look at these as an incident, as something that is isolated, or one of the things that is included in the language of a disaster or a catastrophe is that that has a connection to people more broadly, right? It's not the same in that when we talk about a disaster, the implication is that this is harm to the world. It is bad to everybody. And so when we use a case study like this, part of what we're going back and forth on is to talk about whether or not this is something significant. And if you look at something like failures and even harms produced by the rocketry done in the SpaceX program of development for private rockets, we don't get the same sense of disaster, right? The connection of those things to many people is very different. And so this case study also lets us look at how there are differences between public and private ventures, between a national program and a private practice. And so there's a lot to what and how harms or events are understood. Similarly, because it was such a big deal and because it was so extreme in the moment, it was very thoroughly investigated and documented. And one of the things that students who are going to do case studies over the course of the semester in this class have to recognize is that makes a difference. Pardon me. The sorry, the utility of a case study is affected by how much information you can have, because we're making decisions in real life, we have very partial or limited information. And when we use case studies to learn about, either to teach with, or one of the other ways we use case studies is so that we can determine better practices, better decision making, better structural ethics, especially for the future. Now, this is not just structural ethics. It can be structural ethics, that is, ethics which are rules or mechanisms in order to allow more ethical practice in the future. It could also be a rule-based system in deontological or consequentialist ethic, where past actions are shown to produce certain kinds of outcomes, or past actions are used to refine the duties or the rules that define right and wrong themselves. But if you're going to do that refining process, or if you're going to use it as a teaching tool, a detailed case study where a lot of the internal discussions, where the intentions, the goals, the specific decisions are known, are much easier and more productive. And finally, it becomes a particularly complicated ethical question because we have multiple systems of professional ethics, right? We have people who work for-profit companies, we have people who work for the government, we have people who are scientists, engineers, who are appointed or elected to office. There is a stage at which refusal to participate in work tasks is done. We have a stage where whistleblowing or breaking the rules and allowing information out as a form of honesty is done. And the ongoing back and forth between different people trying to produce an ethical action, an ethical decision on their part, within this complex case, within this social embeddedness, become part of it. So all of that said, it becomes a very famous case study, but it boils down to some fairly simple facts, right? We have a piece of unknown information prior to the event. Will a plastic O-ring or a composite O-ring, will the O-ring work, or will it have cracked, or will it function incorrectly? Will it function at all below the temperature that they had tested it to be used in? And as a very simple thought experiment to think about this, right? Many of you will know the basic physics here, but if you heat and cool something, the material expands, it contracts, it changes the structural resilience of it. It can become fragile, uh, and you can do things like crack a glass bottle or even cut a glass bottle with a heat source and a bunch of ice water. Right, and all of a sudden we move to this situation where we're talking about a giant complex material structure in the form of the rocket boosters, and it's easy in some ways to assume that a giant engineered structure isn't affected by a 5-degree temperature range. And we knew, or the engineers and in fact NASA had all had communicated that below a certain temperature, this material used on the O-ring might not function. So they have this conversation, in fact, several conversations in an ongoing format for about 24 hours, where they're trying to decide, A, who has the authority and the knowledge to make a decision, whose language, whose inference or evaluation about those risks is the appropriate one. And various people, including Baggioli, including Alan McDonald, including the mission commander, are all connected to those conversations about whether or not the knowledge is available. And different groups of people have different perspectives on how risk is calculated, different perspectives on what is included in complete honesty. And those different groups, those different expectations, and the ethical frameworks and theories that they're using produce this point of confluence or interaction where somebody makes a decision, that decision is communicated, that decision is changed in the communication, and all of a sudden we have a disaster. And one of the things that we want to use out of this case study is this idea that the standards and the perceptions of how we're looking at things is fundamentally important, right? We can't separate the subjective bias. And this, again, is why it is so important as an ethical case study, because we have a tendency to see human factors, subjective bias, cultural embeddedness, social stuff, all as outside of technical decision making. And one of the things that we want to bring back in is that you can't actually separate those things out. All ethical decision making is socially embedded. All technical decision making is social decision making. All technical decision making is ethical decision making, and those are non-separable things. So, in earlier incarnations of this class, I had you read 2 chapters out of the Harris textbook, and much of the second chapter was about this idea of honesty. And we'll come back to some of this discussion when we are talking about professional ethics, the codes of obligation, and some other topics later on. But I want to, in connection to the example, the case study of the Challenger disaster, and then another case study I'll talk about in the next slide, I wanted to just come back to this concept of honesty, and in particular, to return to why we're not talking about virtue ethics. And part of the reason for that is my, as professor, educated perspective that virtue ethics will not be as useful for students as a concept. And part of it is that they are fundamentally, like intentionally or directly out of what they are, not as straightforward, not as specific, as complex and as messy as consequentialist and deontological ethics can be. Virtue ethics are indeterminate. They are not firm ground. And that's the way they're supposed to be. So when we talk about somebody saying, I am an honest person, that doesn't specify what kind of honesty that is. And at the core of how virtue ethics works, it is to try to be what we're talking about as an aspirational ethic. Your decisions are moving towards, working to be, to produce yourself as a virtuous person, a person who has whichever virtue. And if you're talking about honesty, that means that you're measuring your action against whether it makes you a more honest person. Which isn't a bad thing, but it doesn't actually tell us much. It doesn't tell us what honesty is. It doesn't tell us what other virtues or attributes are measured in that. And in part, it also doesn't tell us whether a specific action is productive of that in a measurable way for us. Does it match the duty or the rule that the obligation or the definition that is deontological? Does it match the mechanism of measure to produce outcome that is in the consequence? And so we're not going to advocate for, we're probably never going to mention again until the very end of the class, the idea of, well, actually, we'll mention it around the Amish also, but there'll be quick mentions of virtue ethics. We're not going to talk about it substantially again, but here's the way to think about it. Whether you want to include concepts of virtue ethics is a separate question. When we talk about virtues, what we're talking about is a complex network of specific attributes, performances, behaviors, ways of thinking, and intentions, all of which are wrapped up into one object, one way of being. And that's too much, because the word honesty means so many different things. And so when we talk about honesty, for instance, when I talked about honesty and communication in the example of the Challenger, what we're looking at is not, are those people honest? Are they honest kinds of people? We're trying to break it down into specific forms of decision and specific kinds of actions. So while the quality of being honest may be what honesty is, we're also using it as an index, a category to talk about a variety of actions. And some of those will be important to separate out, right? So absolute openness, right? Absolute truthfulness, whether it's something like telling it like it is, or whether it is the publication of all your data in the sciences, whether it is the presentation of every thought in your head, might be considered honesty, although there are a lot of other ways. When we talk about democratic policy, businesses, transparency, or the openness of process and derivation, that is, why and how you get to the result, that's what transparency is. Transparency isn't give me all the information. It is give me all the information to know why this idea, this thing, this vote, this law, this decision in your engineering portfolio, where did that come from? All the information that led to it. And so transparency is a particularly important concept, both in democratic process, but also in scientific and engineering process. Because if somebody can't evaluate how you get to the end point, they don't know if the process was done correctly. Similarly, we'll talk about the idea of vulnerability and the idea of intimacy or availability for the possibility of harm is sometimes connected to honesty, right? If you only tell people the things that you're not scared of them learning, you're intentionally selecting in a way that may deny them important information for them. You may be producing bad outcomes. And so honesty can be connected to the concept of vulnerability, that is, being willing to provide information that may or may not, right, may carry a risk, may or may not produce an easy or positive result for you. And so that could be thinking about things like being demonstrative, showing where emotional or subjective aspects exist rather than only providing content information, being receptive at the same time to hearing other people's perspectives, right? Vulnerability includes the idea that we are willing and able to hear and accept truth from others. And that is a fundamental part of honesty. It is not only about not lying. Um, Recognition and admission of limitation of knowledge is one of the fundamental forms of honesty that is useful and requisite, that is required of engineers and other professions. If you don't know the answer, you can't just say this is good enough. You have to acknowledge the limitations on your knowledge. Um, Authenticity and integrity, right? Is this the right kind of behavior, the right action for yourself? Is it the right behavior and action for an engineer? Is it appropriate to the kind of discussion, the kind of honesty that we want to use? Completeness versus omission. Lies of omission are just as much lies as an overt untruth. Little white lies, which can be thought of as beneficial dishonesty. Well, um, we're not talking about whether the dishonesty or honesty is good or bad. That's a different kind of ethical question. We're talking about what honesty is, and those are dishonest. Now, again, if you're using a consequentialist ethic, once you recognize this, you can then say, is this productive of an appropriate beneficial outcome in a better way than other kinds of honesty would be, right? If I told some form of truth rather than a lie, would it be better? Creative direction or framing or rhetoric, that is manipulation and persuasion, so that people understand and see the form of answer that you want, either by characterizing or shaping their interpretation, um, is a form of honesty or dishonesty, right? You want them to get the accurate, truthful perception, not just to avoid lying. You're actually trying to get more truthfulness out of communication. All of these things, whether you're talking about honesty as loyalty or responsiveness to obligations and duties, and this comes from a basis that the idea of honesty is you are retroactively being dishonest, right? If you said something and forget that you're going to turn your homework in on time, you are being dishonest. It's not an accident, right? You may not have intended to be dishonest, but you have said, I will give you the homework on this date. The homework is now late. Therefore, that makes that a lie. And so it's not only the action, it is the responsiveness to your obligations, your duties, your past statements, right? If you said something and you then learned that it was false, it is a requisite, it is required of honesty that you then fix that dishonesty. Um, Truthfulness to yourself, truthfulness to others, um, increasing or productiveness of truthfulness. And it gets complicated. And so this is why when we look at this concept of honesty or virtues like honesty, justice, truth, wonderful things that they are, they're not how we're going to be talking about ethics, particularly around a professional ethics class in most cases. We'll have an occasional reference to larger virtues like this, but it won't be the main way. So to wrap up, we are talking about decision making this semester, and we're using the traditional mechanism of decision making of theories of ethics, right? Ethics as mechanisms or theories or ways to achieve right action are variable and diverse. They do not necessarily get agreed on by everybody. And so I often say, I don't tell you guys what moral beliefs to hold. I, in fact, rarely tell you with the exception of you are a student, therefore you have an obligation not to cheat in plagiarism. You are a professional engineer, you have an obligation to live up to the public trust. Those are specific ethical agreements in our society that you agree to by joining. And we'll come back to talking about that idea of the difference between a duty and an obligation and a voluntary obligation. But here's the thing. If we accept that we make decisions and that ethics are about that, then this is the first and main ethic I will tell you to do. In order to make a decision, you actually have to make the decision. They aren't accidents. And in order to do that, you tend to need to do what's called paying attention to process or reflexivity. And that is literally saying, am I making the decision the right way? And you also have to accept that you're making a decision and you have to actually make it. You don't hedge, you don't delay, you don't say it wasn't my fault, it was this moment, I was pushed into it. Intentionality is accepting the decision. Right? You in fact say there's a determination to do a decision, you performed an action in making the decision, and that was the completion of it. It doesn't say that you don't look at all those other factors. It doesn't say you don't acknowledge contributions or contexts or situations, but it says at a fundamental level, the decision is yours. It's ownership of it. And this is a specific ethic that says if you want to make decisions well, you will practice and affect reflexivity and intentionality. And we'll come back to these two concepts a number of times in the semester to reinforce and talk about them. How you make a decision and that you accept you're actually making a decision instead of doing it unintentionally, those are central to making a decision be a decision and therefore be a good decision. The classic example, continuing with the idea of being hungry and not hungry, or should you eat or should you not eat. To give you an example of reflexivity and intentionality, we've all had the experience of walking down the street, realizing we're hungry, getting food without thinking about it, and then you realize a block later there was someplace else to get food that was better. Now, if you'd actually thought about where and how to get food, how to perform the action of eating, you'd end up at the food you preferred. Now, that may be because you should have eaten something healthier. It may be because you ate something you didn't actually enjoy eating, but a block later was a restaurant you would have preferred to eat at. Maybe you spent too much money and you could have spent money cheaper. There are 100 ethics to apply within that. But recognizing that you should have made the decision well and that there could have been a better way to make the decision, that would have produced a better right action, an improved action, an improved result, that's always going to be part of the process of good decision making. Now, a little bit separately, but still related to that, is that we need to have good, reliable information to make decisions, right? And that means that you have to practice and develop attention to research. That means you have to think about attribution and academic rigor, or the importance of using good sources and good information. And it also is really important to be able to recognize when something is an issue of fact and an issue of interpretation. Those are two different things. And that's part of what it means to make a decision. It's not a weird thing. It's not a separate thing. You cannot make a decision without some level of reflexivity or a very specifically known process, right? You can take the heuristic that you're taught and never be reflexive about it. That's in fact in some ways replacing intentionality for reflexivity. You say, this is the only way to make this decision. I never have to think about it. I accept that. This is the right way. That's lots of intentionality, but no reflexivity. How do you know there isn't another way to make that decision that would be better? Is there the possibility you could improve on that heuristic, on that formula? Are you having the right information put into that formula? into that calculation, into the algorithm? Well, so all decisions, all production of an action and then an outcome will, to some degree, meet with some level of reflexivity, intentionality, and research.
Howdy. So I just wanted to make a note, especially for people listening to the video, so that you might not be seeing the slides. This is the end of the required lecture. It was already far too long. What follows is a slide about the process of the final project, and we'll talk about that in class a little, and the exercise for in class on Thursday. But then after that, there's a whole bunch more slides that were cut for time. And while it might not be how you want to use your time to listen to all of them, you might glance at them and see. They were all useful things to talk about, but maybe not for today in this lecture.
We'll probably have a separate, we'll certainly have a handout, but we'll probably have a separate recorded little lecture for you guys at some point on research as well as the handouts. But the basic process for the semester project is an iterative development project, right? Stage one, you have a broad definitional problem. I'm going to work on X, right? So what's the deal with the decision to use sampling in music? What's the deal with the batteries in Tesla cars? What's the deal with switching from giant container freight ships that use diesel fuel to sailing ships, right? You pick a big topic and you begin learning about that big topic. The premise in an iterative and developmental research is that you don't actually know what questions to ask about that thing until you've started the research. So mostly the first submission, your first paper iteration, you will be submitting some annotated research to show that you've begun. It is a huge problem writing this paper in the last weekend of the semester. You will never get a good grade on it. It's really not, as scary as it sounds to you guys, that hard to write one of these papers over the course of the semester. But that requires you to work on the schedule where you're actually doing extra reading. You're going to the library website, to the databases. You're going to JSTOR or Academic Search Premier, and you're finding articles related to this. And there'll be handouts, and there'll be time to talk to me in office hours about research, but you have to start that early. That first broad category and initial research document is due around 6 weeks from now at the midterm. The next time you turn work in, you'll be working on developing a broader understanding. You're using more peer-reviewed articles. You're getting a narrower focus, right? Instead of talking about what's the deal with sampling in music, you've now learned that there's a huge difference between the history and the technology of sampling in pop music versus the way that it's done in classical music, and you aren't really interested in classical music, so you look to the 1980s decision that led to the use of pop music sampling in hip hop, especially in this period. And then as you narrow down, you go, why did these people make these decisions? And you'll find sources on things. Or you'll be looking at the details of why they use certain kinds of steel to make the Titanic. It doesn't matter to me what the questions are. It matters to me that you think about what you're doing, how you answer questions, and how you do research. As you do that in the second stage, you'll be trying to narrow down to some groups and some events so that you can narrow down in the third stage to a specific decision. That specific decision, you have to be able to find specific research information to show how and why a decision was made, because your final question is, was this right? Was it the right way to make the decision? Was it a good outcome, and why? And you, as the interpreter, as the ethical evaluator, are taking a stand on what kind of decision that is and whether it was done the right way. And that's what you're supposed to do. Normally, I actually also make you all practice giving an ethical argument from a specific ethical perspective in person by making you stand in front of the class and tell people. And that can go very well, it can go very poorly, but it's really important because most people do not have the experience of saying, here is my ethical argument, here is how I argue it, here is why it's important to other people until they're in the middle of a crisis, and it can be extremely difficult. So you guys normally would do a 2-minute sort of elevator pitch like you would to your boss at work, right? Faced with a decision like this, you don't make it the way you're making it, or you do make it the way you're making it. We're not doing a presentation, but you can think of this research process as being the same way that you would do that if you had to argue with your boss that he shouldn't do something. You do research then. You would not just walk in and say, I believe this is wrong. You don't make unsupported arguments and want them to actually convince people. So that's the semester project. It's sometimes I refer to it as an ethical evaluation or a decision profile. It's a case study research project.
Now, maybe I'm about to make some philosophers angry, but before we talk about traditional ethical theories for my TikTok-based tech ethics class this week, I want to talk about how they're useful. Like, why am I teaching you about utilitarianism and deontology, especially when those are just more examples of the westernization and whitewashing of philosophy? The truth is, they're not actually useful in a practical sense, in that no one is or really should be a hardcore utilitarian or deontologist, no matter what we want to say about Tony Stark or Batman. As you think through your own ethical stances about things, you will see glimmers of these different kinds of frameworks. But the important lesson here, I think, is that you can analyze a situation using a different framework and come to a completely different answer about whether it's ethical. And that is an important lesson for ethics. Hi, I decided to teach my tech ethics class on TikTok. I know it's not the same, but if you want to follow along and learn some stuff and maybe even do some readings that are optional and no one's grading you. First up is traditional ethical theory, which you can learn about with the Avengers or Hank Green, and also there's a bunch of other readings too, including stuff like how do we feel about philosophers being racist? So every week I'll post new readings and topics, and then the next week I'll post videos about the kinds of things that we talk about in class, and I'll also hold office hours at a particular time on TikTok Live if you want to come talk about stuff. Anyway, follow along. You can also check back to this document because I'll link to videos that are relevant, and I don't know, tell your friends that you think might want to learn about technology and ethics and policy.
Okay, so here's the thing. We've now talked through the whole structure of what we're trying to get through. I've introduced a variety of ethical theories, and I want to just go back and reiterate something. While we'll talk about an ethical framework that is both the way that you're trying to build up to do ethical thinking, but also what you're already carrying around, all of those different ethical theories, all of those different moral, cultural, legal, etc. theory that you have sort of piled up, and some of it's tied together and some of it's isolated, but you're carrying it around with you. And one of the things that ethical theory does is let you decide, let you think through it, let you recognize what things are. When you have a name for something, it is easier to recognize it, right? The people you see in a crowd of strangers blend together. You don't necessarily pay attention to them unless something draws your attention to them. And that means that when you learn the name of a person or an idea, when you learn a way to understand it, it becomes more visible, more understandable, and in some ways more important. So while we could talk about a variety of different ethical theories, what we're using is traditional ethical theory because they will allow also communication with others. They are common. And that often has this side problem that if people have associations or misunderstandings, it could be new problems. But it still offers you a language to have those communications. When somebody says, it doesn't matter that you think I did something wrong, and they said, then you can ask, why wouldn't it matter? You did this thing, this action. And they say, well, the outcome is this. Well, then you can recognize that and say, but you're assuming that the only way to understand that is through the consequences, right? You can recognize those differences. And in a minute, we'll talk about other examples, but I wanted to just once again say that theory is a lens. It lets you interpret and understand things more correctly. And the same thing is true for other kinds of theories, but in particular with ethics, because so many of the moral, religious, legal, and cultural rules and systems of evaluation and determination of action are naturalized. That is, they are thought of and felt to be normal, natural, and unquestioned. They become background. They become that stuff that we can't see where one thing starts, one thing ends. We can't make a selection. We can't respond to it as easily. And ethical theory does, by its very strangeness to the way we normally talk and think about things, allow us to break out of that normal. And so when we use ethical theory, what it does is allow us to view a specific piece of action, of effect, of what's going on or what could go on in the world, and recognize how it would be different if we are directed or paying attention with a different ethical theory. And so when we use ethical theory, what we're doing is applying it as a mechanism for us to be able to use critical thinking, to be able to use an idea and allowance of projecting or moving forward in decision making in a more careful, intentional, and reflexive way. Now, I also wanted to mention here that there are lots of resources for this class. There are lots of ways to think about it. So one of the ways that I wanted to mention was for anybody who happens to want to watch videos rather than just listen to me while you look at slides, I put in, this is Dr. Feisler's videos are up on her TikTok page. She's a professor of ethics who focuses on technology and is better at communicating these ideas perhaps than I am. So if you want to look at those, in particular, as we get to the week on the trolley problem, I think there's a lot of overlap, a lot of connection between how their class, Dr. Feisler's class, is talking about the issues around the trolley problem and how we will. Not the same, can't substitute for the readings and discussion that we're having. But for anybody who is interested in that as an example, it is a useful thing to look at. When we are choosing and playing with ideas, we can pick from different sources. We can use different modes or media. And that the results, when we do that, offer us the opportunity to think about things differently. And when we use theory in this way, it gives us a lot more options to think about. It makes us potentially capable of being more open-minded. In general, in this class, I try to focus us on ethics and not on values. Values being beliefs about what is important, good, or valuable that we're taught as we grow up. And the complex issue there is that, especially around technology, we can't have a conversation about technology without dealing with a whole lot of ideas about the value and the importance of technology that we're taught. At a basic level, Western society, especially in the United States, but all of modern Western society, comes about through a conversation between what's called humanistic and instrumental values. Instrumental values are things that originally were important because they allowed you to get somewhere, right? Efficiency is important because what is produced efficiently is important, not because efficiency is important. It is instrumental. It is a way to do. And by contrast, historically, Western society, and this is pretty broadly speaking, has shared a sense of a number of different values: peace, love, harmony, charity, kindness, all sorts of things that were seen as human and innately valuable on their own. Instrumental values, including efficiency, functional hard work, and things like that, effort, were not individual values. They were not universal values. They were not humanistic values. Those were instrumental values. And one of the things that happens is as we start to have a love affair with technology, we start to forget those humanistic values and we see the instrumental values as valuable on their own, in their own case, for their own sake. And it's not to say that that's a terrible thing, but when we're doing ethical evaluation, we have to be clear about which of those values we're talking about. When you talk about something being of good, especially if you're talking about a consequence or an effect, the good that is produced has to be understood, why it is good, what's good about it. So if you say something like it's innovation, then you can't just be saying it's new. It has to be new and better for a reason. The word innovation isn't about replacing what is old unless your argument is that simply being newer is fundamentally of value. And when we're talking about that sort of thing, if we're talking about something being a value, a good, an ethical good especially, we should know what it's producing, what it is, why it is a good, what is beneficial about it. At the center of the slide is this idea from psychology of Maslow's motivational model or hierarchical needs that some things produce or demand our attention. And it's interesting because a lot of the time we sort of get muddled up in what need something is fulfilling. And the reality is that much of the time, if we're busy, if we're working hard, we can forget the most important values, the most important benefits, because we have to focus on other kinds. Certain things have to come first. You have to get paid so you can get fed, and that means that's the most important thing, but it doesn't have to be. And so in the background of our discussion of ethics, we need to keep which values, goals, or benefits are the ones we're going to value and think about in our mind.